As one of the authors on the ICAT Just Transitions Monitoring Guide, I am going to walk you through the methodology presented in the guide to support you in applying this in your context. We'll begin this training video by walking through what exactly the Just Transitions Monitoring Guide is, describing who should use the guide, what the benefits of Just Transition Monitoring are, and then we'll dive into the recommended steps from the guide. The ICAT Just Transitions Monitoring Guide was developed by the World Resources Institute with support from the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency. The guide provides a methodology to support the development of a monitoring framework that will enable governments to track the status of a just transition as defined by their stakeholders and to inform policy. Monitoring just transition is useful for tracking changes in relevant indicators, but monitoring alone cannot explain what is causing these changes. It is not meant to be a policy assessment tool which helps attribute impacts and changes to specific policies. The guide provides information to monitor and analyze social, economic, and environmental changes that may occur as countries implement policies to transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. It provides a step-by-step approach to support the development of a monitoring framework that will enable governments to track the status of a just transition using indicators pertaining to distributive, procedural, and restorative justice to understand the changes being experienced by different groups. The guide was designed for government agencies and ministries, such as those responsible for development, climate planning, data management, and finance, and for national, subnational, regional, or local jurisdictions. The recommendations and considerations included here, however, can also be used by non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, and financial institutions to support government-led tracking efforts or to better engage with the transition process. There are numerous benefits to monitoring just transitions. One of these is to inform transition and development policies. Monitoring just transition indicators can inform decision-making, enhance policy coherence, and contribute to the design of future policies. Gathering data on relevant indicators can help establish credible baselines, capture trends, and provide insights on the direction of change across selected areas of interest. Just transition considerations are becoming more prevalent within international and national climate policy and are increasingly being included in nationally determined contributions or NDCs and long-term low-emissions development strategies or LTLEDs. Consistently monitoring changes in socioeconomic environmental indicators can facilitate policy modifications and policy design. Another benefit is that monitoring enhances accountability and transparency in climate action by sharing information on decision-making processes, goals, strategies, and potential impacts. It allows stakeholders to hold decision-makers accountable for their stated commitments. Finally, monitoring can facilitate access to climate finance. By tracking just transition-related indicators, countries can monitor and document their progress towards outcomes that may have been agreed upon as part of funding from domestic or international sources. For example, as part of monitoring plans agreed under the Just Energy Transition Partnerships or JETPs. Tracking can also demonstrate readiness and commitment towards an inclusive, equitable transition to potential investors and to partners. The next portion of the training video will walk you through the following recommended steps: developing just transition-related goals or priorities, formulating targets and key social, economic, and environmental indicators, establishing a data coordination and collection process, analyzing data to understand trends, communicating and reporting results to reflect changes and inform policies and decisions. It is important to note that just transition monitoring is a process that can evolve and become more comprehensive over time. For example, targets can be set after baseline data has been collected after some years of data collection. More indicators can be added, and new and improved data collection methods may be adopted with time. Now, let's look at these steps in some more detail. The first step in the monitoring process, as is laid out in the ICAT Just Transitions Monitoring Guide, is to develop the goals and priorities for just transition monitoring. The key considerations in developing just transition goals or priorities include preparing for an inclusive stakeholder process, identifying impacts, developing goals and priorities, and validating these with stakeholders. Stakeholder involvement is critical to ensure procedural justice and to focus monitoring on areas that stakeholders consider to be just and equitable. There are several actions and accompanying strategies users should consider to prepare for an inclusive stakeholder process. They should identify stakeholders from sectors of the economy that are likely to be affected during the transition, as well as from key at-risk communities. Stakeholders can be identified through self-selection, through mapping of stakeholder groups and at-risk communities, through mapping of sectors that are likely to be affected to identify relevant businesses, workers, and unions, and through records and population data, as well as through expert consultations. As an example, in South Africa, the Presidential Climate Commission, or PCC, engaged workers from the coal, automobile, agriculture, and tourism sectors after identifying them as being at risk based on a National Employment Vulnerability Assessment and the sector's Jobs Resilience Plan. A list of relevant stakeholders may include businesses and trade associations, CSOs, traditional leaders and indigenous communities, youth groups, women, low-income groups, labor unions, academic institutions, etc. Next, it is critical to build capacity of stakeholders by building readiness among communities and societies to meaningfully engage and participate in all aspects of the transition. Strategies to achieve this include allocating adequate time and resources to enhance stakeholders' capacity to meaningfully participate in discussions. These meetings can be structured according to the capacity needs of the involved groups and include sharing relevant background information. It is also important to promote participation and engagement by planning when, how, and where stakeholder discussions occur and ensuring that stakeholders are aware of the entire process. Other ways to promote participation and engagement may include producing outreach and communication materials in appropriate languages, preparing questions that promote a deep discussion of how stakeholders interpret a just transition and what kind of concerns and expectations they have. For instance, questions may include: what support does the community need to ensure a decent life? What are stakeholders most concerned about in a just transition? What do stakeholders see as the main challenges of the transition? And what sectors and policies should be considered to ensure a fair transition? On this slide, you will find an example from South Africa of how they built their inclusive stakeholder process. While developing a just transition framework for South Africa, the Presidential Climate Commission, or PCC, first provided information to the public about their net zero transition and then held stakeholder consultations to understand how they viewed a just transition. During this process, the PCC employed a variety of instruments over a few years. For instance, they held workshops and events with ministers, civil society, businesses, labor, traditional leadership, youth, and the research community. The PCC drew on national experts from a variety of fields, including business, labor, civil society, by commissioning a series of essays that explored how to achieve a just transition with a focus on sectoral resilience. Smaller group consultations were conducted with workers in communities and with social partners and impacted businesses to allow groups to discuss their own development pathways. Stakeholder groups and the broader community were invited to comment on the draft Just Transition framework. A series of in-person community consultations were held to engage municipalities and traditional leaders. A large multi-stakeholder conference was also organized to seek stakeholder support for the Just Transition framework. Next element to consider in developing goals and priorities is to identify impacts. Several social, economic, and environmental changes are likely to occur during the transition, such as those related to employment, health, social well-being, industrial competitiveness, prices of goods and services, air pollution, gender equality, and others. Users should develop an understanding of the potential changes that may occur, how various groups may experience the transition, and how risks and opportunities may be distributed across society. Users can utilize the ICAT Sustainable Development methodology to assess social, economic, and environmental impacts of their policies. They can also use other impact assessment analysis and tools to do so in collaboration with their stakeholders. Distinct from goals, priorities represent key impact areas that should be monitored during the transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. For instance, priority areas may include monitoring jobs in fossil fuel as well as clean energy sectors, the availability of finance for vulnerable communities, or access to clean, renewable energy. It is important to remember that not all impacts should be considered priorities, but impacts with a high likelihood of affecting communities or of significant magnitude should be identified as priorities. Users can choose to look across social, economic, and environmental changes when considering priorities, and some examples of these changes across the three dimensions are noted here on the slide. Just transition goals, on the other hand, can be thought of as high-level statements indicating desired outcomes across social, economic, and environmental dimensions. They should articulate long-term, justice-oriented, and inclusive change that should accompany the transition to address climate change. They describe how communities interpret their future in terms of their people and their place in society. A good test of whether a goal is a just transition goal versus a climate or any other type of goal is to check whether it specifically addresses one or more of the three types of justices: distributive, procedural, or restorative justice. Just transition goals can be process-oriented or outcome-oriented. Process-oriented goals are goals related to processes that are necessary to ensure a positive, just outcome, whereas outcome-oriented goals are goals associated with the ideal future state that should be realized. Specific activities that can help achieve process-oriented goals may include engagement of stakeholders in decisions related to their work, their health and safety, social dialogue between policymakers, unions, and businesses to inform just transition decisions, or due consideration for environmental safeguards and standards. Outcome-oriented goals represent overarching aims and objectives, such as achieving an innovative economy with skills and education to realize a low-carbon transition. Process and outcome goals can be informed by several inputs, including a national-level just transition vision and theory of change process, if one exists. A theory of change describes how transition policies may lead to targeted results, what kind of enabling environment may be needed, and the risks that should be managed for the desired just transition goals. Users can assess impacts and develop a theory of change to understand potential risks and how policies are likely to minimize or address those risks and contribute to desirable goals and outcomes. The ICAT Sustainable Development methodology draws on the causal analysis approach, which is central to developing a theory of change to assess environmental, social, and economic impacts. Its methodology can be used alongside the ICAT Just Transitions Monitoring Guide to identify potential impacts for communities and sectors and to inform the development of just transition goals to address these impacts. Various forms of ex ante impact assessments may also be used, such as economy wide assessments, regional studies to analyze impacts, or sectoral studies. Other inputs include existing just transition goals in policies and available impact assessments. Users can complement and validate impact assessment through surveys or consultations with experts and stakeholders to identify the current climate policy effects people are experiencing. Stakeholder feedback and information can be systematically gathered and analyzed to identify any overarching concerns that could inform goals, targets, as well as indicators. By developing process and outcome goals by many inputs, such as theories of change, national visions, existing goals, and any available impact assessments, it ensures that goals are not developed in a vacuum and are rooted in the social, economic, and political context. Here we have provided specific examples of just transition priorities as compared to just transition goals. As you can see, the priorities on the left are more general than the goals on the right, which are more specific or even time-bound. It is important to note users can choose to advance from priorities to defining goals over time. Some may choose to combine approaches. For instance, they can establish priorities for sectors where just transition-related conversation is less advanced and set goals for other sectors where there is greater stakeholder awareness about possible impacts. This slide notes some best practices associated with goals. Not every just transition goal needs to have every single one of these qualities, but it is a good frame of reference to try to have as many of these qualities as possible in formulating your goals. The next element of developing goals and priorities is to review and validate goals with stakeholders and publicly communicate that they have been developed. This may include opportunities such as seeking public comments once draft goals or priorities have been prepared, demonstrating that the voices of the vulnerable and affected groups have been considered in shaping the drafts, and sharing feedback received through additional stakeholder workshops. The second step in the ICAT Just Transitions Monitoring Guide is to identify targets and indicators. To stay on track, users should identify relevant targets and indicators that can be monitored over time. Indicators convey how the transition is unfolding and whether desirable progress is being made. This module provides guidance to users to develop targets and indicators pertaining to social, economic, and environmental development in line with their stated just transition goals or priorities, develop monitoring indicators, and how to apply a justice lens to indicators. After goals or priorities are created and validated, users should develop targets to track progress. Targets provide benchmarks to monitor progress to understand how the transition is unfolding. It should be noted, though, that while targets are recommended, users may choose to set them over time based on data and resource availability. In such instances, users can start with monitoring their indicators and subsequently develop targets. Users should consider the scope and number of their just transition goals or priorities, as well as the capacity required to monitor when determining the number of targets to be set. Further, users should aim to establish at least one target per goal or priority that has been developed. Finally, as with goals and priorities, Impacts identified through Sustainable Development Impact Assessments can also be used to inform setting up of targets and indicators. Users can adopt common best practices to set realistic targets for goals. For example, as shown here in the table on the slide, they can develop targets that adhere to the SMART principles, that is, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound targets. In addition, targets should be informed by and aligned with the Just Transition goals or priorities to ensure coherence. Targets may also derive from or complement NDCs, long-term targets, Sustainable Development Goals, sector-specific, or any relevant existing policy-related goals. Some governments may already be monitoring select social, economic, and environmental developments and may have set targets that can be utilized. Targets may also respond to anticipated impacts of specific policies and potentially deter negative consequences associated with mitigation. It is important to distinguish between short-term targets, which are often less than 5 years, and mid to long-term targets, which are between 5 and 15 years. Users can develop mid to long-term targets that are transformational in nature and ensure that their short-term targets help set them on the path to deep systemic change embodied by the long-term target. Users should also define interim milestones to not lose sight of the final aim along the way and to identify early signs of challenge or weak progress. If progress is too slow, the target may not be reached. When progress is occurring in the right direction and at the desired pace, the corresponding indicator trend line, highlighting the change over time, aligns with the trajectory to achieve the short-term target value. This can be regularly monitored to stay on track for the mid to long-term target values. This is an example from Antigua and Barbuda, which has outlined some outcome-oriented goals in its Nationally Determined Contribution or NDC. These targets contribute towards the outcome of supporting social inclusion, gender issues, and reducing risks arising out of climate transition, and pertain to small and medium enterprises, women-led businesses, and to students. Coming to indicators, these can be used to capture social, economic, and environmental changes and reflect how the transition may affect communities, consumers, households, workers, and economic regions. The Just Transitions Guide focuses on monitoring the changes that may occur as economies and sectors transition to address climate change. Indicators, however, do not establish a cause and effect relationship between policies underlying the transition and the changes being observed. Indicators being observed can change not just due to policies, but also due to other external drivers. Users interested in causal analysis can apply this guidance in combination with the ICAT Sustainable Development Methodology, the ICAT series of policy impact assessment guides for sectors, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Policy and Action Standard. Nevertheless, indicators themselves provide valuable information on the direction of change and are a necessary input into causality analysis, seeking to attribute impacts to individual policies or groups of policies. An understanding of policy impacts can also be used to identify indicators, as they can be used to identify goals and priorities and targets. For example, a user may conduct a policy impact assessment for policies to reduce methane emissions from livestock or policies to promote regenerative agriculture. The impact assessment may show potential implications for farmer livelihoods and for food security. The user can then develop corresponding indicators to monitoring changes in these impact areas that emerge through the assessment process. Users should utilize existing indicators or develop new indicators where none exist to monitor and track changes in desired areas. Indicators should be developed irrespective of whether users have formulated their targets. However, where targets do exist, indicators should align with them. For example, if there is a target for achieving a certain number of good quality jobs by a certain year, users should monitor progress towards it through a corresponding indicator that measures number of good quality jobs and that defines what constitutes good quality jobs. For understanding just transition related changes, indicators should go beyond monitoring greenhouse gas emissions and help track changes towards social, economic, and environmental goals or priorities. This could include monitoring full-time jobs in given industries, population coverage under social protection programs, and others as shown on the slide. Users should also consider indicators pertaining to underlying enablers and barriers that may signal or impede future change. These could include monitoring investments, monitoring support measures, and others as also shown on the slide. For just transition monitoring, indicators should also provide insight into the degree of change with respect to the distributive, procedural, and restorative justice aspects of the transition. Distributive justice addresses differences in changes being experienced by varied social and economic groups and demographic groups, or by place or region. For instance, an indicator that measures upskilling and training opportunities with respect to urban versus rural regions is an example of indicator embedding distributive justice. Distributive justice-related indicators monitored through data disaggregated by demographic groups are often more common than other justice-related indicators. Procedural justice-related indicators look at how groups are being empowered to participate and what kind of processes are being followed to allow for greater capacity and participation across different groups. Procedural justice indicators address issues such as inclusive and participatory decision-making and access to information. Restorative justice indicators monitor who has been harmed and how to repair and redress this harm and prevent future harm. Climate-related restorative justice has mostly been discussed in the context of adaptation, loss and damage, or in relation to environmental harm and human impact as a result of infrastructure development projects such as hydro projects or mining projects. On this slide, you will find more illustrative examples of just transition indicators organized by economic, social, and environmental dimensions, and also by the three justice categories. This slide notes some overall best practices for indicators. Indicators should be clearly defined and include units of measurement. Users should also note details such as how often should indicators be measured, using what kind of methodology, and where should data come from. Indicators should be relevant to just transition goals or priorities and measure movement towards achieving desired changes. Another consideration in indicator selection is feasibility, whether the selected indicator is feasible in terms of data needed or not. Is the data already being collected, or can it be gathered in a cost-effective manner? Existing indicators can be identified through literature review, expert interviews, and by reviewing established indicator data sets. Governments may have indicators that they monitor nationally, such as the Social Progress Index in India, which uses almost 140 state and district level indicators to track changes across issues such as nutrition, shelter, water and sanitation, environmental quality, inclusiveness, and access to advanced education. National and international organizations also have extensive sets of indicators and data across multiple countries. However, these may not include sufficiently granular data and thus may be limited in assessing changes at these levels. Finally, indicators should be distinct and unique. Users should strive to limit the total number of indicators, however, especially new indicators, to be able to balance available resources across all indicators.
The third step is to establish data collection and coordination processes. Credible data on just transition indicators, collected through well-established processes, can help determine baselines, identify spatial and temporal trends, assess progress, highlight correlations and patterns to be further analyzed, and inform policies. This presentation discusses how users can develop a data management framework for just transition indicators to streamline the collection of information. The figure here illustrates the key elements to developing a just transition data management framework. This includes understanding the elements involved in the just transition data management process, appointing a data coordination body, organizing a data collection process, and finally, collecting data. The session will also discuss data disaggregation and collection methods. So what kind of data should be collected? At the core, data needs to be credible. Credible data can be defined as data that is accurate, timely, relevant, accessible, and sufficiently disaggregated. Monitoring the wide variety of social, economic, and environmental indicators will require extensive data collection. The number of just transition-related indicators will depend on the needs. The larger the data set, the greater the coordination required across various agencies. Some agencies may already be collecting this information, or new methods and arrangements may be needed for new indicators. With that in mind, data management frameworks should consider prioritizing some indicators over others. Not every indicator will be able to be tracked and analyzed due to limited staff capacity or data availability. Establishing a comprehensive data collection framework is an iterative process that will take time to fully realize. Ideally, the prioritization of indicators should be done in close consultation with representatives from impacted stakeholder groups to ensure procedural justice. Second, governments should consider data already being collected at different governance levels relevant for monitoring social, economic, and environmental indicators. In some cases, new data collection processes may need to be established. Existing monitoring processes, such as those related to the Sustainable Development Goals, national greenhouse gas inventories, and sectoral policies spanning social, economic, and environmental issues, can be expanded as needed for tracking just transition indicators. Over time, users could envisage a framework that can monitor both greenhouse gas and non-greenhouse gas indicators, including just transition indicators. Central to the data management framework, users should appoint a data coordination body, such as a national statistical office, that has the mandate to govern, manage, and provide oversight for data collection and management. Given the scope of just transition monitoring, the body should seek broad participation and representation from government agencies and other key actors. Tasking an inclusive representative body with coordinating data management can streamline data collection, avoid duplication, and efficiently utilize limited resources. An existing entity tasked with data management, such as a national statistical office, planning commission, sector ministry, or academic institution, can be responsible for coordination, with support and representation from all stakeholders. The coordinating body may formulate groups and committees for specific functions, or to collect specific data. Working groups could be formed to provide input on specific topics, such as developing indicator metadata, review of existing databases, and data sharing arrangements. And an implementation committee or advisory group could be formed to mainstream just transition data collection. The coordinating body may appoint expert teams, advisory bodies, working groups, and other kinds of multi-stakeholder bodies to lead and support the specific activities based on needs, skills, and knowledge required. The coordinating body should have the political and legal authority to carry out its responsibilities, which may include the following: taking stock and reviewing existing databases, determining and addressing data gaps, establishing institutional and organizational arrangements for data sharing, collecting and compiling data, developing short and medium-term budgets and pursuing financial opportunities, synthesizing data and preparing reports for dissemination, providing oversight and coordinating reviews, building in quality checks and controls, and establishing roles and responsibilities for data monitoring and providing other technical support. Having a legal mandate and authority will strengthen the coordinating body's ability to facilitate institutional and organizational arrangements, such as letters of exchange and memoranda of understanding across ministries and other key partners. Organize workshops to familiarize teams with indicator definitions, data quality requirements, and collection methods, as well as to address data gaps. Convene a statistics and data quality group to review and encourage the use of consistent definitions, methodologies, standards, and protocols across departments and across data producers. Secure buy-in and support from government leadership and key stakeholders to facilitate and prioritize sustained funding, such as through budgetary allocations of government funds. As an example, in Bangladesh, the Bureau of Statistics, or BBS, is the appointed statistical organization for providing data relevant to the 105 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. The BBS has regional offices in larger districts, sub-districts, and metropolitan centers supporting a national data collection effort. Bangladesh's whole-of-society approach involves government agencies at national, subnational, and local levels, non-governmental, international, and civil society organizations, development partners, the private sector, businesses, academia and professionals, political representatives, and other relevant stakeholders. In terms of data collection, this entails identifying sources to obtain indicator data at the appropriate level of disaggregation using relevant data collection methods. Data can be disaggregated and organized by category, including the following: gender, age, employment status, disability, education level, income level, type of household, urban versus rural, level of governance such as provincial, municipal, district, or community. Data may also be disaggregated for different geographies or regions, for example, by body of water or type of ecosystem. For example, the proportion of displaced workers supported by transition programs could be disaggregated by gender and age or for a particular industrial region. Ultimately, it is important to specify the desired level of disaggregation. Additional common data disaggregation categories include national level data, which can provide an overall picture and inform high-level policy decisions and resource allocation. Regional data, which can help illuminate a region's economic strengths and weaknesses. Community-level data, which can reveal job displacement risks specific to distinct communities. Locally disaggregated data that can help identify the concerns of communities. City-level data can offer insights into urban infrastructure and vulnerabilities and inform urban planning. Data can also be disaggregated at the sector level. Data may be collected through several means, including surveys, by either conducting new surveys or reviewing existing ones, as well as administrative records. Although collecting new data requires technical resources to conduct extensive surveys and can be quite costly. Multiple levels of disaggregation, such as data disaggregated by women of a certain indigenous group or falling within a certain age range, can become even more challenging. In addition to collecting data directly, the coordinating body can establish obligations to incorporate data disaggregation within a jurisdiction's statistical processes. Doing so can streamline disaggregation for select categories, as individual organizations may define these differently, which would make it difficult to consolidate or compare data. The coordinating body can also provide guidance on levels of disaggregation in indicator metadata templates. They can constitute working groups to identify challenges and make recommendations for further disaggregation. Data can come from many sources, and users should identify primary or secondary data sources for individual indicators. Primary data is collected directly by the responsible authority or organization, and secondary data is collected by other organizations, often for purposes other than monitoring the policy of interest. It is important to first map existing data sources and databases that could be utilized for a given indicator and determine data gaps. Users should consider whether the existing data source is accessible and up to date. Based on the kind of data gaps that exist, users can decide whether additional resources should be used to collect new information. Users can also explore peer-reviewed literature. Academic literature and research studies are a good source of data, though these may not always be country-specific. Industry and business data, market data, financial reports, and investment data all have information on labor market trends, job vacancies, and skill requirements to help understand workforce implications of the transition. Non-traditional data sources, including from communities and citizens, and new innovative data sources should also be considered, such as citizen-generated data or crowdsourced data. Policy analysis and impact assessment studies may also be relevant and have relevant data on effectiveness of policies and measures and their impact on various regions and communities. Data collection methods may be informal or highly structured. Where available, users should employ established methodologies and standards and comply with applicable laws regarding privacy protection. Methodologies should be consistently applied, and any changes and improvements should also be properly documented for transparency. The coordinating body can also adopt several measures to ensure data quality. First, it can develop data collection templates for harmonization and consistency. Templates help ensure the data collection process is standardized. The coordinating body can also develop indicator metadata templates with information on the what, where, and how for each indicator to further harmonize the data collection process. Key elements for data templates include indicator name, rationale, data provider, limitations, definition, data sources, disaggregation, and validation. The fourth step of the guide is to analyze data. In this section, we'll cover the key elements to analyze data. This includes assessing trends and analyzing changes, documenting sources and methods, and learning and evaluation. One of the most simple forms of analysis that can be completed with data is a trend analysis. A simple trend analysis can reveal the current state and direction of change. Indicator data for a single year tell an indicator's current status and can be used to understand existing conditions for a just transition and to establish baselines for future assessments. Identifying trends, however, can take longer depending on the indicator. Pairing such analysis over the long term with policy impact assessment can help decision makers better understand outcomes. Users should collect indicator data over multiple years to identify trends that highlight the direction and pace of change. For example, as part of South Africa's Sustainable Development Goals country report, the government considered data on 175 indicators. For one of these goals, decent work and economic growth, the country monitors the proportion of South African youth who are not in education, employment, or training, among other indicators. Figure 6.2 shows that the percentage of South African youth in this category has remained relatively constant. This can be compared with regional data. For example, for 2022, South Africa's percentage, 35.2%, is higher than Sub-Saharan Africa at 25.7%. Data analysis can draw attention to such disparities and create support for specific policies to improve youth education and employment. Another option for analysis is the backward-looking analysis. Users can examine indicators alongside a historical reference point or a future target to be achieved, which would be a forward-looking analysis. Backward-looking analysis can be used to compare an indicator's current value against a historical reference value to show whether the indicator value increased or decreased, signaling progress or lack thereof. Because data is collected regularly, the change in value will demonstrate the level of progress, but not attribution, towards the just transition. For instance, a backward-looking analysis of Costa Rica's per capita energy consumption shows that energy consumption has nearly doubled over the last 40 years. These figures reflect energy consumption that is the sum of all energy uses, including electricity, transport, and heating. Users can measure how far an indicator is from future targets and if the distance is increasing or decreasing. In Chapter 4, users determine specific indicators to monitor progress towards the transition, such as volume of lending for small and medium-sized enterprises in US dollars, or share of households without electricity. Users can determine overall positive movements towards a just transition by tracking the change in an indicator's value and level of progress toward a related target. For example, users can monitor the share of households without electricity towards a target of 100% household electrification by 2040. Over time, users would want to see a narrowing of the difference between the indicator's value in a specific year and the target. The rate of progress towards the target is also important. If the pace is too slow, the indicator value may not reach the target value by the target year, despite a net change over time. This is where interim milestones help. They provide early signs of challenges and weak growth. Users can also draw a projected trend line that forecasts into the future based on the average historical trend, thus combining forward and backward-looking analysis. An example is presented here, which shows the percentage of Senegalese population with access to electricity. This is one of the indicators Senegal monitors for its goal of achieving universal electricity access by 2025. As the figure illustrates, the historical trend likely needs to be accelerated to achieve the 2025 target. Users can also discuss trends across multiple indicators or levels of disaggregation to provide additional analysis. For example, access to electricity among urban versus rural populations, access to electricity along with quality of access in terms of reliability, and kind of appliances that can be used. In addition to analyzing individual indicators, users can form composite indices by assessing clusters of indicators to derive a single value. The index value represents the result of changes in several indicator values. Users can adapt existing indices or develop new ones with experts and stakeholders. For example, the United Nations Development Program combines several indicators, such as the maternal mortality ratio, higher education attainment levels, and women's participation in the workforce, to generate a gender inequality score at the country level. Called the Gender Inequality Index, it reflects gender disparities in health, empowerment, and the labor market. The figure here shows Nigeria's Gender Inequality Index score, illustrating overall progress around gender equality. A lower Gender Inequality Index value, closer to 0, signifies lower levels of gender inequality. A rating of 1 represents a society in which one gender rates as poorly as possible across all three dimensions. Although using an index adds complexity to the analysis, it can help to communicate results and promote active engagement with the policymakers and other key stakeholders. Not all stakeholders will have the time or the ability to review individual indicators, so indices can simplify and increase accessibility of the results. However, users should document the index methodology to facilitate a better understanding of indices and ensure transparency. Lastly, users should draw upon the analysis results to inform policy recommendations and adjust existing climate programs and policies being monitored. For example, the results can act as input for updating NDCs to better reflect just transition priorities. These results can inform new interventions, such as strengthening reskilling programs, increasing energy access, and improving procedural aspects. They can also help identify funding and resource needs and provide recommendations about where funds should be allocated to maximize positive outcomes. During the transition, users can conduct a systematic assessment of the changes monitored to evaluate progress. Monitoring and analyzing data provides the basis for learning and evaluation. Interpreting lessons and insights from observed trends can help facilitate understanding of the contributing factors. The final step recommended in the guide is to communicate and report results. The key elements to this chapter are: identify the target audience, determine what information to communicate, and determine the best way to share information. To do this, users should ask themselves 3 questions. First, who is the target audience? This can include members within the government or key stakeholders outside the government who should receive information, or a domestic versus an international audience. Users can also provide information to audiences outside the country, such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. nations are increasingly sharing information externally about their just transition plans, although they are not yet tracking their implementation. Part of identifying target audiences is also understanding their role, what they should know about the analysis, and how the information may be of benefit to them or used in their decision-making processes. The second question to ask is, what specific information does each stakeholder group need and why? Policymakers will likely have different interests than impacted community groups. The third guiding question is, how should results be communicated? Distinct formats may be needed for individual stakeholder groups, and reporting frequency may also differ based on the audience. This table shows an example of what information could be communicated based on the audience. For example, process-related details could be shared with impacted stakeholders to show transparency related to procedural justice, while technical information related to the Just Transition Monitoring framework and progress could be conveyed to high-level officials who are more interested in a condensed summary. The decisions on what to convey and to who will look very different and should be based on the contextual needs of the Just Transition. This concludes the training on the ICAT Just Transitions Monitoring Guide. Thank you for your time, and if you have any questions on how to get involved or to develop a Just Transition Monitoring framework, please contact ICAT.